Hi, and welcome to another episode of Words of Ages. There are many of us working in this field who are troubled by the story of history that we're being given, that we are being fed, that's taught in the schools and universities, and that's relayed by the media. This, it seems to be a story that is designed to convince that we are the point of it all, that the whole human project has been about us. And I think there's a tremendous arrogance in that and failure to learn the lessons of the past. And we should realize now that if we don't learn the lessons of the past, we are actually doomed to repeat it. A new religion is being created as we speak by a new generation of people who think they are non-ideological, who think they are very rational, who think their past myth, who think their past story, who think they're better than any of their ancestors and have never bothered to even study their ancestors. You could say that we got here by enacting a certain kind of story where for most of our history we lived like any other creature in the world as hunters and gatherers living at the mercy of nature. We had very little control over our environment. We are told that it was a time when life was nasty, brutish and short. But this would change when we learned one fundamental manipulation agriculture. It meant that we could grow food on our own, We no longer had to wander. We could build homes, freeing us to specialize trade and make new technology. This was the turning point, and along with this would come a dramatic shift in how we saw the world in time. Instead of seeing ourselves as one creature belonging to a vast community of life, we would see the world as something that belonged to us, something we could manipulate and use as we saw fit. This worldview is now so widespread that it's normal to look at nature as nothing more than a collection of resources, just waiting to be extracted, mined, and put to economic use. This way of looking at the world transforms everything we see to the point where we begin to look at ourselves and each other in much the same way, where it's now common to talk about human resources and how to maximize the productivity of people in the same way we might try to maximize the efficient use of any resource. This has brought unprecedented growth. But what's the cost of thinking of the world in this way? The author Daniel Quinn uses the analogy of flight, try to imagine these early moments when the first people tried to build and test flying machines. They would pedal furiously, pushing themselves off the ground. But because these early models didn't comply with the laws of aerodynamics, they eventually came crashing back to the ground. But in those first moments, just lifting off the ground was exhilarating. It felt like flying, even if they were only falling. Quinn argues that 10,000 years ago, our society began a similar kind of flight, a civilizational flight, and at first everything seemed fine. We felt the freedom from the constraints of nature, allowing us to wipe out competitors, change the world's landscapes, and traverse the globe. But we aren't free from these natural constraints. We are subject to them and they are catching up to us. We already see signs of it in things like famine, irreplaceable resources being devoured, and whole species disappearing every year. And it's not just other animals that are disappearing, it's other human societies and ways of life. So why is this important? Because every indigenous culture on this planet is an unbroken chain of knowledge and understanding that stretches back to the beginning of human life itself. Each is adapted to a part of the world that has been tested and refined over thousands of generations through a process that began even before we had the words to describe what they were. And every time we lose an indigenous culture, a specific form of wisdom that stretches back to the beginning of humanity disappears from that world. An anthropologist, Wade Davis, points out it's easy to forget that our particular worldview is just one model of reality. It doesn't exist in an absolute sense, and it's only when we take the time to look at other cultures in ancient traditions that we recognize that there are many other ways of being, which, if you think about it, can only fill you with hope. So what can these ancient traditions tell us about navigating the challenges of our time? Let's look at few ideas in this video. From an economic point of view, we often look at a mountain as a dead pile of rock and minerals waiting to be mined, or a forest as rows and rows of potential lumber waiting to be cut down. But from that perspective of many ancient traditions, the earth is a dynamic and living thing. It's the source of all life in this planet, and it's quite literally our life support system. but we live as if the world and everything in it belongs to us. By comparison, the perspective of many ancient traditions is that we belong to the world. We can see this idea, for instance, in the traditional approach to Taoism, which seeks to cultivate the self in a way that lives in harmony with the rhythms and patterns of nature, balancing the yin and yang. It's the recognition that the universe moves with its own natural ebb and flow, and that we can achieve flow ourselves when we align with these natural cycles. Embedded in this is the principle of Huai, also known as effortless action, which we look at in this video. And implicit in this is the idea that the divine exists within everything and within everyone. Understanding this encourages a respect for ourselves, other people, and all the elements of nature, even if you're a skeptic to these ideas. Look at what it means to have these perspectives. For example, how does the society that views nature as a collection of unused resources make decisions? How does that lead to the way that it treats the environment, its people, and how does that compare to a society that views the world as a balance of the material and the divine? Our society has a way of magnifying the differences between us and fixating on all the ways we are separate and isolated from each other. But from the perspective of many traditions, this is very much an illusion. As Alan Watts points out, we often use phrases like coming into the world, but it's much more accurate to say that we grew out of the world, much like a leaf grows out of a tree. And if we imagine ourselves as a vast ocean, our culture encourages us to view each other as isolated waves of water that appear on the surface, when in reality it's impossible to see where one wave ends and the other begins. We are part of an entire universe of energy, responsible for the expression of all things that we see around us. From the perspective of traditional Taoism, each of us is filled with a flow of energy known as your personal chi, a life force that brings with it vital energy. But there's also a concept of a cosmic chain, the idea of a life force that connects each of us to each other and to every part of the universe. And so the things that happen on the cosmic key level also have an impact on us at the personal level. This is similar to the Western maxim as above. So below, which implies that knowing yourself is to know the universe, and to study the universe is to study yourself. Our society spends about $39 billion a year in an effort to stay young. And so it perhaps comes to no surprise that our own views of medicine are based on a clinical and pharmacological model of health that's deeply uncomfortable with death. But that's a growing recognition that spirituality is also an important part of health, and healing in modern medicine often neglects the spiritual dimension and is in some cases hostile towards it. But many ancient traditions just don't embrace death as a necessary part of life. They see death as offering a doorway to spiritual growth. We see this, for example, with the indigenous people of the Amazon rainforest in their use of ceremonies involving ayahuasca, which means vine of the dead. It's a combination of plant medicines which creates a psychoactive brew that makes the chemical DMT available to the gut, and it's intimately connected to their spiritual concepts about what happens to us when we die through ayahuasca. They experience powerful visions and insights which they bring back with time to inform the choices they make in their everyday lives. Many of their paintings or otherworldly and feature intricate geometrical patterns that reveal a system of spiritual ideas that describes what happens to us after we pass on from this world. What this reveals is an ancient recognition that our conscious, alert state of mind isn't the only one available to us, and it's often important to question our current modes of being. And whether or not you believe these perspectives are true, it can't be denied that these cultures confront death intimately and see it as an essential for spiritual growth, and this enriches their everyday lives and their connection with nature. It deeply informs how they live in the world by comparison in our world. Death remains one of the most persistent taboos in Western society, and one of the clearest examples of this is the ways in which we treat the elderly in our reluctance to talk about death, even though it's one of the most natural and unavoidable part of life. In the end, we do have a choice. What kind of a world do we want to live in? This is not a false choice between traditional and versus modern and all of that, It's about going back to some reimagined pre-industrial past. It's about our right to choose the components of our lives. It's about asking ourselves, how do we find a way to keep the benefits of modern life without demanding the end of other modes of being? Because, as Wade Davis points out, the very existence of these alternative ways of living puts the absolute lie to those in our culture who say we cannot change. If you like this video, please show your support by hitting the like button, sharing and subscribing to the video. And make sure you press the bell icon. Thanks so much for watching. Take care of yourselves. And I'm hopeful I'll see you in the next video.